à la Turque. Before that, the film critic and columnist Brien discusses his heroes.
Nobody ever goes to Sunderland by accident. Our guest in Heroes tonight once wrote, nobody ever happens to pass through it. Growing up there in the 30s, we were as cut off from that faraway capital of empire, London, as any other colonial people. Well, Brien obviously believed what the missionaries told him, because eventually he packed his little spotted handkerchief and took that dangerous overland trip to the capital, where he now works as a critic and journalist on the Sunday Times and Punch. In those early days in Sunderland, did you feel that it was a town that needed heroes, that made people want to have heroes?
Yes, well, we had a couple of heroes. General Havelock was one, who I didn't realise was not my idea of a hero, is the man who went out there to put down the foreigners and put down the Wogs and the Indians. But he happened to live up the road, and the council estate that I lived on, Ford Estate, is where he came from. So we thought of him as a hero. But on the whole, I'm not in favour of heroes. I think it's an unhappy place that needs heroes. Not that I object to what the hero actually does. It's the hero worshipping that I don't like. The idea that you have to put up somebody who's so much better than you are, and you have to say, well, let him do it. And all of history tells us, everything we know from biographies and autobiographies, that heroes are men just like us. They've got the same fears, they've got the same worries, and sometimes they break through, sometimes they do something, but we should never exaggerate them. Every man should be his own hero.
Doesn't it give people a lot of pleasure, though, thinking about heroic deeds and the people who do them?
Well, a lot of things give people a lot of pleasure. I mean, all sorts of nonsense gives people pleasure. I mean, belief in fortune-telling, belief in clairvoyance, so on. I rather object to that. I mean, if you want pleasure, you must take the result that you get from it, which is that you have a false and distorted view of the world. I mean, most of the people that I would say were my heroes that we'd be talking about are people who saw things clearly and honestly, and took a rather severe and austere view of the world. And I think that's the only way which we can regard this disintegrating world, and the only way which we'll ever survive.
Also, your heroes have considerable flaws. I mean, Orson Welles you picked as your first hero, and he's a rather flawed character. I mean, having started very well, having been a genius in his early work, he did rather peter out.
Yes, I'm not so sure that peter out. He rather sort of exploded out, really, and grew vaster and more extraordinary, but less successful. But when he began, I mean, the great thing about Orson Welles, I saw Citizen Kane during the war, about, I think it was 1941, at Havelock Cinema in Sunderland. And another thing about my heroes is that I allow myself to admire them because on the whole they were unsuccessful at the time that they were heroic. I mean, the easy hero, the one that everybody loves, is the one you should suspect. The one who is not even known at the time is probably the real one. I remember going to see Citizen Kane and the noise of the tip-up seats being pushed back as people left because they couldn't understand it. They didn't know what this was. They thought it was nonsense. And I sat there and watched it. And it formed two things in my mind. One was that I wanted to be a journalist because it's really, it's a dream autobiography of Orson Welles himself, but it is also about the romance and the irony and the power and the hollowness of journalism. And that excited me very much.
You're beautiful.
Oh, I can't.
Yes, you are. You're very, very beautiful.
I've never been to 6 parties in one night
Extremely
in my
beautiful.
whole life. I've never even been up this late.
It's a matter of habit.
I wonder what the servants will think.
They'll think we enjoyed ourselves.
Yes.
Didn't we?
I don't see why you have to go straight up to the newspaper.
You never should have married a newspaper man. They're worse than sailors. I absolutely adore you.
Oh, Charles, even newspaper men have to sleep.
I'll call Mr. Bernstein, have him put off my appointments until noon. What time is it?
I don't know. It's late.
It's early.
Charles, do you know how long you kept me waiting last night while you went to the newspaper for 10 minutes? What do you do in a newspaper in the middle of the night?
Emily, my dear, your only correspondent is the Inquirer.
Sometimes I think I'd prefer a rival of flesh and blood.
Oh, Emily, I don't spend that much time on the newspaper.
It isn't just the time. It's what you print. Attacking the president.
You mean Uncle John?
I mean the president of the United States.
He's still Uncle John. He's still a well-meaning fathead who's letting a pack of high-pressure crooks run his administration. This whole oil scandal.
He happens to be the president, Charles, not you.
That's a mistake that will be corrected one of these days.
Your Mr. Bernstein sent Junior the most incredible atrocity yesterday, Charles. I simply can't have it in the nursery.
Mr. Bernstein is apt to pay a visit to the nursery now and then.
Does he have to?
Yes.
Really, Charles? People will think...
What I tell them to think.
Well, as a film, you see, that is absolutely tremendous. The whole piles of things occurred there that had never occurred before. I mean, it seems obvious now, but in those days, they never had a set with a roof on. I mean, they never actually had anything that seemed like a real room. They didn't have the depth of focus. They didn't have the overlapping dialogue. They didn't have, as we see there, this tremendous narrative power at the same time as jumping from scene to scene. And people found it very, very confusing. But
do you find images of the journalism portrayed in Citizen Kane
Well,
is relevant to the journalism that you work in today?
That's right. Well, it was what started me into journalism, was seeing that. He, of course, it was his first job at the age of 25 in films. I mean, he'd been a great success in the theatre and on the radio. And funnily enough, it's a very radio-oriented film. I mean, the use of sound, the things that people can do, the little voices that are heard, the actual use of a narrator, the actual voice of him saying, this is the film, and saying, my name is Orson Welles. That's very radio-like. And added to all the problems he had, because he put down 2 films that never got made, and he had to rush into this one. This was his first great thing. They were going to give the boy genius the chance, and it's made with tremendous speed, which you can see. And the whole thing has an immediacy to it. And he went into that, and he added to it the fact that he made it appear to be about William Randolph Hearst, who was the most powerful newspaper tycoon in America. So when the film came out, it was attacked in every Hearst newspaper thing. So he was already doing that. That seemed a little bit extraordinary at the time. We weren't quite used to that. Now we've seen much more. We have somebody like Howard Hughes, you see. We see now that this is something that is really part of American life. I mean, Orson Welles is at his best when he's about American life. And my first real job in journalism, I did various small magazines and things, was working for Lord Beaverbrook. And I immediately recognized him as, you know, very much like the Citizen Kane figure, with a tremendous charm, with the lack of morality, with the pushing of political points, which actually his readers didn't want. They enjoyed the excitement of the newspaper. They didn't want to read the message. They loved the sugar, but they didn't want the pill. And I felt, you know, that I'd moved into that world, though, of course, I never became I wasn't the Citizen Kane, I never became even the Joseph Cotton figure, the editor, but I was a man involved in that world.
Your next hero is someone who actually created a hero himself, and you've picked James Boswell.
Yes.
As a hero. And in lots of ways, he actually created the heroic figure of Johnson.
Yes, he did, yes.
Why do you choose Boswell rather than Johnson?
Well, because I first of all came across Boswell when I was at school. I read Boswell's Life of Johnson, as most people at school do. I was very interested in the idea of Johnson, this tremendous man who could always think of a put down. No, sir, he would say, and then you were absolutely smashed. And he was a brilliant man for repartee. But he was a heavy, old figure. He was very religious. He was very reactionary in his opinions. He didn't allow himself any freedom outside of that. Here was Boswell, who was living his life for him. And then by one of these mysterious things, the journals of Boswell suddenly appeared 150 years after he'd written them, and we saw what Boswell was like, and we suddenly had the possibility of a hero who was a little bit of a fraud, who was very charming, who liked drink, who was very interested in women, and that appealed to me immediately. I thought, yes, we must have heroes who are free men.
Well, let's see Boswell and Johnson together on their Highland jaunt.
On this day we set out from Edinburgh. I have given a sketch of Dr. Johnson. Some of you may wish to know a little of his fellow traveller. Think then of a gentleman of ancient blood, the pride of which is his predominant passion. I eat of every good dish, especially apple pie. I drink old hock and everything else bottled, except water. I own myself to be amorous, and have got into an excellent method of taking down conversation.
Nobody in Scotland loves the name of Oliver Cromwell, lad. And yet what the Romans did to other nations, so Cromwell did to the Scots. Oh, I own they'd been a very learned nation for 100 years or so, but before the union with England, they'd no trade, no elegance, and no money. Therefore, the only instance of a people among whom the arts of civil life did not advance in proportion with learning.
We had wine before the union.
No, sir. That was some weak sort of stuff, the refuse of France, which would make you drunk.
I can assure you, sir, there was a great deal of drunkenness.
No, sir, they were people who died of the dropsies, which they contracted in trying to get drunk.
I believe the view of the Firth of Forth from the Castle Hill at Edinburgh is the finest prospect in Europe.
That is the state of the world. Water is the same everywhere.
Well, of course, I could equally also have said, of course, that Dr. Johnson is the hero, because there's something marvellous about a man who is the dictator of his little world in London, and at the same time is bolting this food and pouring down this drink, and the sweat runs down his face. I mean, he used to horrify people by the way he ate, which I always think is something endearing. But my next hero is Engels, who is really more like a hero than Boswell, because Boswell, on the whole, had everything going his way. I mean, he was always short of money, but nevertheless the money was always there, came from a rich and ancient family in Scotland. He had the entree everywhere. But Engels was a German from a cotton manufacturing family who came to Manchester to work in the English partnership of the family. And he worked as a businessman, and he didn't like it. His father wanted him to do it, but he didn't do it for his father. He did it in order to keep Karl Marx alive. Now, his view was that capitalism was rotten, that it was a disgusting way of keeping hundreds of thousands of people down in poverty, and there must be a change, and there must be some alternative, and Marx was going to do this. And so he was the man who made the money which kept Marx going. In 20 years of the Marx-Engels correspondence, there's not, I think, a single letter that Marx doesn't write saying, I must have some money.
Well, here we see him talking to Eleanor Marx about some of the sadnesses of his life.
I'm going to tell you something else. All this bourgeois stuff, you know? I like it. Well, it's not easy to hate something that you're good at. And sometimes I think when I'm pulling my boot on, only one more year, and I'll be out of that accursed office. Then I pull the other boot on and I think, when I get out and I sell my interest, I'll take £300,000 with me. And what a proud man I am. Not forgetting, of course, that money is simply a relationship.
Do you have a fellow feeling for revolutionaries?
Yes, I do. Of course I do. I mean, I'm a socialist, and I believe that the sort of world that we live in is not a world that any decent people would really want to live in, however you cover it, however you say that you're encouraging people of enterprise and saying that is not actually true as we know it. And 2/3 of the world is starving while we fiddle around with useless Christmas presents that we don't really need. Of course, I'm a revolutionary, and I admire Engels because he was able to live in that world. Actually, the the film we've seen isn't quite true. Never made anything like £300,000. I think when he retired from the firm, he had £17,500 he took out, which wasn't much more than he'd put in. He wasn't really a very good businessman. And also, he used to feel very happy whenever there was a crisis in the cotton exchange and the firm was losing money. He said, "This is the revolution. This is the moment coming," which it wasn't. But I like among revolutionaries, women revolutionaries, I mean, whom there have been a great number, but because of the way we write history, because the women's life, if you read in history, is almost always hidden, we don't know very much about them. And one of those that I greatly admire was a woman called Louise Michel, who in France, she was a poet and a novelist and a revolutionary. And when the moment came when the Franco-German War and the Germans besieged Paris and the bourgeois government gave up and the working people of Paris seized power and held out against both the Germans and later on against their own government, she led a man's battalion and she fought there and behaved, I mean, she was as much a hero as any man, although she's still, to a great extent, unknown. Well, after the war, she was tried. The French government came back and took over and shot the revolutionaries. They killed in, I think, 3 weeks more people than died in the entire 3 years of the terror of the first French Revolution, which everybody's heard about, how appalling that is. They killed them. They put them in cages. And women came by and poked their eyes out with umbrellas. Anyway, she stood there and she said this tremendous thing, which I find very moving when she was in the dock, and I've got it here so I can quote it exactly. She said, "Since it seems that every heart that beats for freedom has no right to anything but a slug of lead, I demand my share. If you let me live, I shall never cease to cry for vengeance. If you're not cowards, kill me." In fact, they didn't kill her, but she went to prison. But anyway, that somehow seems to me the thing of which heroes are made of, rather than the Napoleons and the people who were universally admired.
Your next woman, though, in contrast, seems to have been a born survivor, Alexandra Kollontai. Again, with this revolutionary beginning, she seemed to be accepted, assimilated, died in her bed.
Yes, that's true. She was born in the 1870s in Russia. Her father was a general. She became a revolutionary very early on. She went down and gave up her rich life and worked with women in mills and factories and spoke at street corners. She was there in 1905 in the famous demonstration where the Tsarist troops opened fire on an unarmed procession of people, just pleading with the Tsar to do something for them. And she was there when in St. Petersburg when they were all shot down and the snowy streets ran with blood. And then she became one of the leaders of the revolution. She was a great friend of Lenin. After the revolution, she wasn't all that accepted because she didn't like the way the revolution was going. She didn't like the bureaucracy. She was one of the people who ran the workers' opposition, which is to say that the working class, the trade unions, should rule and not the party bureaucracy. But she was a great thing for sexual freedom. She's a very beautiful and attractive woman and had hundreds of lovers. Stalin didn't like her, but she was so powerful, so attractive, that she became the first woman ever in history. Seems extraordinary. 1918, the first time a woman had ever been a member of a government anywhere in the world. She then became the first woman ever to be an ambassador and lived as an ambassador outside. I mean, during the purges, she was away. So she was lucky, but she never changed her opinions, never said anything, and she died in 1952 in her bed in Moscow, having survived, the only Bolshevik that Stalin allowed to survive. Well, you've got to do something to achieve that.
Your interest and hankering after revolution doesn't just extend to the revolutions on the end of a bayonet, though. I mean, you've picked Freud, who was revolutionary his own way too, the revolution of thought. Is that the reason that you put him on your list of heroes?
Yeah, it's partly that, but of course, I mean, on those grounds, I could have equally put Darwin,